Paying attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Hi everyone, this is Andy Steele. Glad to be back for another show, and this is going to be a great one. We're going to be joined today by Tony Szamboti, one of the outspoken engineers with AE 9/11 Truth, and I guarantee if you followed this issue, you've read his work and seen him in interviews. He's got a new paper out, so we'll be talking about that along with other things. So stay tuned, you do not want to pass this one up. Folks, if you go to ae911truth.org, you'll see in the top right-hand corner the question that's going to be asked all over major cities around the world this September. Did you know that a 3rd tower fell on 9/11? And of course, this audience knows very well, and most of you know why that tower fell, and why the first 2 towers fell as well. All right, not because of the magical explanations given to us by our government, but because those buildings were brought down in a controlled demolition that had been planned long in advance before 9/11. The scientific evidence we talk about every week on this show, and which we're going to be talking about again today, proves this. And the result of all that pre-planning of those building destructions was a public that was frightened and which surrendered its natural skepticism and reason, accepting the new state of existence and the loss of liberties in what is now known as the quote-unquote post-9/11 world. And whoever rigged those buildings to be brought down wanted to make sure that the first iconic image of the 21st century was one of horror and destruction, and they succeeded in that respect, but they failed in covering up their crime completely and keeping the public silent. People are waking up in droves, and this is because of the work of groups like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and because of other scandals coming to light which are prompting people all over the nation to look at 9/11 in a new light. This September 11th, the question asking the world community if they know about the 3rd tower that fell, that's World Trade Center Building 7, which wasn't hit by an airplane but fell completely in 6.5 seconds, is going to be in Times Square on a giant billboard for all New Yorkers to see. And I'm going to be there at 5:20 p.m. that day to observe it and be at the planned rally, and so should you folks. All right, it's also going to be on taxi cabs, this message. It's going to be on buses, other billboards that are on highways in other cities. But then what, folks? Well, what then? Ladies and gentlemen, the momentum is on our side, and the system that is protecting the big lie is falling apart. And I'm not saying it's going to be gone tomorrow. All right, it's happening gradually, but it's happening, and you can see it. All right, you can see the loss of trust from the public, the increasing phoniness of the media and politicians. All right, those intellectually and morally bankrupt skeletons who are put up on platforms and who we're told are our representatives and leaders. But they're just paper tigers, folks. All right, they're losing control in so many arenas, including, and probably most importantly, the one that has to do with what we talk about on this show. That's the truth of 9/11, the truth about what really destroyed the Twin Towers in Building 7. And they can't keep a lid on it any longer. All right, even if some people don't want to admit it in the open, they know there's a problem with the story. They see that there's something wrong. And they may play along and give lip service to the system, but the seeds are planted, and when it comes to it, folks, all right, when the chips are down, I have no doubt they will rise to the occasion and do whatever they need to do to protect the destiny of this country and see the truth come to light. But how fast this happens is up to you. And I said before that the momentum is on our side, but we need to increase that momentum. All right, and we can put this issue to rest and bring closure by making this issue known to more and more people. But for that to happen, we need your help. So I'm asking you out there, please join the team. You can go to ae911truth.org and volunteer by clicking the volunteer tab on the right-hand side of the screen. And also participate in the Rethink 9/11 campaign. This is an important event, what's going on right now with this campaign. All right, and to do that, you just go to rethink911.org, you find out how to help out, and you plan to do something this 9/11, no matter how small it is, okay? Just plan to educate your neighbors about this information. The more hands on deck doing this work, folks, the faster we'll be able to right this wrong and face a better future for our country and for our world, and that's really what it's all about. Okay, some quick 9/11 related news. First, I want to tell everyone what Wayne Costi, one of AE 9/11 Truth's volunteers, did last Saturday. And this is a perfect example of what I always encourage people to do. Come up with simple, creative ways to spread the information about what really brought down the Twin Towers in Building 7. He and some other folks rigged a small boat up with an AE 9/11 Truth banner and floated around this festival, some kind of Caribbean festival. There was some kind of waterway around it where they were floating around it with their boat and the banner, and it was happening in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm going to have pictures up at 911freefall.com for everyone to see. But they called the boat the SS Truther, and it wasn't anything super fancy, as you'll see in the pictures. It's just the boat there with the banner over it. But that's perfect. All right, what else do you need? People look out in the water, they see that, they read the message, they get the message, maybe they'll Google it later. And you listening out there to me right now could do that. All right, you can get the banner at the AE 9/11 Truth store and take it to the beach with you, or make your own banner, whatever. All right, but hang it off your volleyball net and get a game going. All right, if you're grilling food or having a bonfire, have the banner prominently displayed there. That would be a lot of fun. You just hold a little beach party and talk about the evidence out there. All right, or you bring it to a football game this fall. Simple things that don't require moving mountains go a long way, folks. So once again, good job, Wayne, for getting the information out there. Also, too, if you go to ae911truth.org, you'll see there's an article there written by Ellie Rica about all the people calling into C-SPAN's Washington Journal with the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence and questions based on it. And it features 9/11 Free Falls compilation videos of those calls. So you can see that there. But a third compilation video is coming out, folks. I just want to let you know that. I'm not sure if it will be out by the time this program airs on No Lies Radio on Thursday, but if it's not, it will be out very shortly. And as I've said on this show before, you'll notice that the tone has changed over at Washington Journal. Okay, people are able to get their questions out more and more on that program. And now I'm going to play you a clip of a call that Congressman Alan Grayson got when he was on Washington Journal last week. So here it is.
Government bill that deserved to be passed. Now we're doing that not just once, but over and over and over again in the 113th Congress, and I feel proud of that.
We have Brian on the line from Greensboro, North Carolina, Democratic caller for Congressman Grayson. Hi there.
Hello. How's it going today?
Fine.
Congressman Grayson, since you're fully aware that government institutions don't always give the full story when it comes to important issues, why aren't you standing by the nearly 2,000 building experts demanding a new investigation of Building 7? There's overwhelming evidence that explosives were used to bring it down.
Now that bin Laden is dead, and now that 9/11 is a decade behind us and more, I think that a good argument can be made that the documents that the federal government has regarding the 9/11 attack should be declassified, and then the truth will come out.
Boring file clerk asks.
So Grayson gave an interesting answer here. All right, very politically savvy answer, actually, because he mentions bin Laden being dead, and in doing so, he's paying his tribute to the official government story so that the kingmakers don't bring the hammer down on him for giving a sympathetic answer to the caller. But Grayson also says that the documents should be declassified so that the truth can be known. And I don't know which specific documents he's referring to, but I can come up with some to match his call. How about the input data for NIST World Trade Center 7 computer models, which are kept hidden, as we've covered here on the show before? Freedom of Information Act requests for them have been denied because supposedly releasing them would, quote-unquote, jeopardize public safety. Give me a break. That would be a good start, releasing that. How about NIST testing World Trade Center dust samples for explosives? Don't you think they'd do that anyway to have a full investigation? Well, they didn't, folks. All right, that'd be another good start. Plus, there's several things kept under lock and key that can be released about 9/11. They have nothing to do with our focus here on the Twin Towers in Building 7, but should still be available to the public so that other elements of the 9/11 crime can be properly investigated. So while Grayson wasn't entirely specific in his answer, he was right in what he said. And notice, too, that the caller didn't say anything about 9/11 when he asked the question, but Alan Grayson knew immediately what he was talking about with Building 7, and Alan Grayson said himself at the end, so the truth can be known. So I'm giving him a B+ for that. Highest grade I've given yet for politicians on Washington Journal being asked about this issue. And the grades are slowly getting better and better, folks. Hopefully someday we'll get an A-plus answer. I believe a day like that will come. Okay, before we get to our guest today, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and everybody who died in the wars that followed 9/11. So we're going to do that right now. Okay, Tony Szamboti is a mechanical design engineer with 27 years of experience in the aerospace and communications industries. His everyday functions include product design tasks, which involve structural and thermal analysis to support the design. He's a member of AE 9/11 Truth and was involved in the Remember Building 7 campaign and appeared on Fox with Bob Mcilvaine to talk about the controlled demolition evidence back in 2010. He also appears in AE 9/11 Truth's most recent documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, and I'm very pleased to have him here on the show today. Tony, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks for having me on, Eddie.
So tell the audience, who may have never heard of you before, a little more about yourself than what I just described. And please include, how did you wake up to the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence, and what made you start speaking out about it?
Yeah, well, I read Stephen. I heard about a BYU physics professor bringing up issues in 2006 about molten metal apparently in the rubble of the 3 collapsed buildings. And at any rate, I had a dilemma about Building 7, and I did accept initially Dr. Zednik Bazant's analysis saying there was a dynamic load or impulsive load on the towers, which amplifies the static load. But when I read Stephen Jones's paper, and he said it looked like there was demolition charges, pre-positioned demolition charges in those buildings, it caused me to wonder. And he said that was the reason for the molten metal in the rubble. And I started looking into it. And as I looked into it, the official story fell apart. And eventually, myself and others wound up measuring the fall of the North Tower. You can measure its descent much easier than the South Tower. It doesn't tilt nearly as much. Less than 1 degree in the first 2 to 3 stories, and it never decelerates. Well, that convinced me there that, unfortunately, Dr. Bazant's proposition that there was a dynamic load couldn't be true, and I don't think Dr. Bazant measured for it initially, and but it showed, nevertheless, it showed his hypothesis couldn't be true, because in order to have an amplified load, you needed deceleration. That's what causes the extra load, per se. So
right. And this is actually part of your paper that you wrote with Graham McQueen, correct, back in 2009, titled The Missing Jolt, right. The Simple Refutation of NIST-Bazant Collapse Hypothesis. And I want you to go over that in some detail here for our audience, people who may not read as much, they like to listen. What's wrong with the NIST-Bazant Collapse Hypothesis?
Well, NIST only goes so far as, in the cases of each tower, they only go to the point where they say the tower is poised to collapse. In the case of World Trade Center 2, the South Tower, they say the east wall has been bowed in and it's ready to buckle and fail. In the case of World Trade Center 1, the North Tower, they say it's the south wall. Now, this is the wall on the complete opposite side of the building from the aircraft hit, that it was bowed in and ready to buckle and fall, and then they stopped their analysis there. And they basically make the claim that once the building falls, it's inevitable to completely collapse to the ground. But like I said, they stop when the wall's bowed in. It hasn't actually quite failed yet. They say they have pictures of that, photos of it in the North Tower. The South Tower, we can see that I see it bowed in as the tower collapses, but there's some small bowing before that in the case of World Trade Center 2. World Trade Center 1, there's only photos. There's no video that I know of. They say there's photos of it bowed inwardly minutes before. But regardless, there's no failure yet, complete failure. So they stop there, and really there's several steps to getting complete propagation. They have to propagate completely horizontally across the building. Then they need it to drop. So they depend on Zednik Bazant for the vertical propagation. But both NIST and Bazant skip the step in between their bowed-in wall and the vertical propagation, neither one of them really explain in any legitimate detail or with calculations the horizontal propagation. In the case of the North Tower, it's very swift. They failed at the 98th floor, and it propagates in about a half, 0.5 to 0.7 seconds. So that is quite rapid across a 207-foot square building. And all those columns. It's sort of hard to believe that it could even happen with, I think it's impossible in a fire situation. So at any rate, once that happens, you have this vertical fall. Now here's where Bazant gets involved. He originally said there was there would have been a very powerful jolt or deceleration. And the way that gives an amplified load, now the building is built to handle several times the load above it. You have a factor of safety. So you can't break a structure designed to handle several times the load above it by placing the static load on it. It has that on it. It doesn't fail. But if it falls on it from a distance above it, it can. And the way that can happen, I was explaining to you in our phone call, the static load is equal to mass times gravity. That's the force, static force. An amplified load is equal to that static load, mass times gravity, plus mass times the deceleration of the impacting object. So you need a deceleration. It actually accelerates the impacted object. Without that deceleration, there can be no load amplification, and since the structure is designed to handle several times the static load, without an amplified load, you can't break it up. So the point being in that paper, The Missing Joel, was that there was no amplified load. Therefore, they did not have a complete story. They didn't explain the collapse. Now,
so just to reiterate, so there's no deceleration. So I guess my question is, if it's continuing to accelerate, how does the top part of the building crush it and do that without slowing down?
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. It would have to slow down, and it doesn't slow down. It continues to accelerate and gain velocity. So the point that the only way that could happen is for the structure below to be being removed prior to the upper section hitting it, or at least softened. By that I mean there is a resistance. The North Tower does not fall in free fall like Building 7. The North Tower falls at about 2/3 of gravity. David Chandler's measurements show it accelerates at about 64% of gravity. That means there's 36% resistance. The columns were capable in those buildings, the core columns, of handling 300% of the load above them, and the perimeter columns at least 500%. So what you only have 36% resistance of columns that just prior to that could, on average, provide nearly about 400%. So you had essentially 90% of the column strength was being removed, and only a small amount remaining, which could not handle the static load. It'd be like having a plate set on 10 columns, or let's say 30 columns, and you remove 27 of them, where each one of those columns could support 5% of the load. Well, when you take 27 of them out, it doesn't have enough left to support the load, and it'll just fall through it. That's essentially what happened. They didn't remove every little last bit of the structure. They weakened it, softened it to the point where the upper part could not, or the lower part could not sustain the load of the upper part. It just fell through it with a small amount of resistance.
Now, it's funny because, you're refuting Bazant, and I brought up while you were speaking a copy of his paper, Why Did the World Trade Center Collapse? A Simple Analysis, and it's dated here September 13th, 2001, and then I guess expanded September 22nd, 2001. And I just want to get your take on that timing. What do you say about a paper that purports to explain why these buildings failed so soon after the event happened?
Yeah, it's kind of strange. Dr. Bazant did know measurements. He just assumed very quickly that it was a dynamic load, and he put the paper out. Whether Whether he was asked to put that paper up by somebody, I don't know. But it was termed at the top, there's a heading, Rapid Communications. So I think somebody wanted some kind of plausible explanation put out there to head off speculation.
Right, and folks, again, without us knowing any motives or anything like that, the point is, that is very fast to get a paper out trying to explain this massive event. So it's just amazing, and you get that out there so quick, it does a disservice to real scientific research that comes in the years afterwards, because it puts in people's minds this explanation that may not be true.
Right. I mean, I was one of those people that believed it. I would say I wasn't completely comfortable with it. There was a little bit of unease, but I wasn't extraordinarily skeptical. I did accept what he said initially for the first 5 years or so, until I started looking into this myself due to reading Stephen Jones's paper that said there was other problems, there was other causes. So I guess you realize we've also there's a new paper out by myself and Dr. Gregory Zolodinsky and Dr. Richard Johns. I'm the only one there without a PhD. So the new paper, which is called Some Misunderstandings Related to World Trade Center Collapse Analysis, we look at Dr. Bazant's analyses in depth and show basically that they're invalid. That hadn't been done before. I had been complaining for quite some time that he grossly overestimated the kinetic energy of the upper section. I'm speaking strictly of the North Tower here, which has been measured, and we know the mass and we know the velocity, so we know the actual kinetic energy. He grossly overestimates that, and he does it in two ways. One is he exaggerates the mass to be nearly 2 times what it actually was, and then he has the upper section falling through the first story at free fall. Well, that's impossible. And in the paper, we call it his vanishing story concept. That is thoroughly impossible, and it didn't happen. So we show his kinetic energy is grossly overestimated. We also show that he grossly underestimated the column energy absorption capacity, which is the ability of the columns to absorb that kinetic energy. If the columns can absorb more kinetic energy than what's available, the collapse will arrest. Well, it turns out that's the case, and it's the case by a significant margin. So even giving 25% of the columns, removing 25% of the columns completely from the action, there's still much more column energy absorption capacity than what there was kinetic energy. Those collapses should have stopped after a 1 or 2 story fall in those buildings. Now, there's people on the internet, of course, anonymous people, that want to claim the columns missed each other. But there's no natural explanation for that. Okay, the inertia, in order for the upper section to shift, there would have to be a lateral load, and I mean a large lateral load. You don't move a building section an acre in size around without a significant lateral load. The inertia of the building is going to stop that, and the columns weren't immediately detached. All right, these things didn't just break like toothpicks as soon as they started falling. Structural steel is very ductile. When it buckles and bends, it stays, it remains connected. It's not just fractured and broken apart like a brittle item. It has upwards of a 21% elongation, meaning it would have to stretch over 21%. A 12-foot column would have to bend and stretch more than 2.4 feet before it fractured. Well, that's not happening. So those columns are still intact. The lateral load would have been enormous to make this shift, even a few inches. So the columns would have stayed aligned. In other words, this thing's still going to drop where it is, and it would drop right over the columns below it. So what we show in the new paper is that the columns essentially weren't involved, because it would have arrested in 1 or 2 stories, and the resistance is so much less than what the columns would have provided that, in essence, they couldn't have been involved. So you have to ask yourself, the next question is, why weren't the columns involved? And they weren't involved from the beginning, because even in the descent occurs too fast, much too fast, for heat weakening buckled columns to have caused.
Right, and also, too, because you've mentioned this, and you've touched on it somewhat, but if you can elaborate, the loads that these towers were built to sustain, how much does that play into this debate, and can you elaborate on that a little more?
You mean the loads they were built to sustain, the columns?
Right.
The vertical loads? Like I said, the core was designed to handle 3 times or a little more the load above it, and the perimeter columns only had 20% of their capacity used, or just under that, actually. So they could handle 5 times above. And the reason for that, for the perimeter having a higher factor of safety even than the core, 3-to-1 is a pretty good factor of safety, is they had to handle seismic and wind loads in addition to gravity. So they would have been stronger for those reasons. But when there's no earthquakes or wind loading, all that strength is available for gravity loading. So with respect to just gravity, the perimeter columns could handle 5 times, a little over 5 times the actual load above them. And the core 3 times. Now, to give you an idea, just 72 columns, if you could have a very stiff plate, very stiff acre-sized plate, the 9 columns on each side, on the corner of each face, that would be 18 columns per face, the 9 on each corner, the perimeter columns could handle the load of that entire building. Now, the factor of safety would have been 1 right there, but just to show you how strong they were, you could have went down to 72 columns to handle the entire load. The rest were reserve strength. That's how strong those buildings were. That's how robust they were.
And what's the simplest thing you would say? I mean, you basically explained it already. I try to think of the layman out there, the people who are listening, may not know all these technical terms, who will say, well, a plane hit the building and that's why they failed. I mean, I want to reiterate that these buildings were strong, is what you're basically saying.
Right. The buildings were very strong. And let's go back over, that's a good question. Let's go back over what happened. Let's go over, we haven't done that yet, really. I just said that we removed some of the columns, 25% to account for damage and fire. And let's look at what the airplane damage actually was. I think the NIST report, in fairness, does a good job here. They show the wings would have been shredded. They went through the exterior wall, but they would have been shredded in that process. They were at an angle, at about a 30-degree angle, and they would have went through somewhere around 5 floors. 4 or 5 floors, I think. And those floors were stiff in the direction they were going through them. They were going through their depth. So the wings were shredded. So what you had left to reach, the wings never reached the core. What you would have had left is part of the fuselage and the landing gear, which is small relative to the building, and the cores of the engines, which are small relative to the building. So you could take the 16.5-foot diameter fuselage and run it right through the building, completely through it. And you're only going to get about 6 core columns out of 47. So on the outside, we can see that 15% of the columns were destroyed, and 6 out of 47 is about 13%. So there was about 15% of the columns which would have been severed and damaged to the point where they couldn't handle their loads. So you're still left with about 85% of the columns intact. And then let's go to where the collapses actually initiated, which is interesting, because they initiated in both buildings actually above the aircraft impact damage. In the North Tower, it was the 98th floor. The aircraft had entered the building, pitched downward at 10.6 degrees at between the 95th and 96th floors. So it would have been a full 2 stories below and also pitched downward below where the collapse initiated. Almost none, there was no column damage on the 98th floor where it initiated. That's something to think about. In the South Tower, the aircraft entered somewhere around the 80th floor, 79th, 80th floor, and it initiated at the 82nd floor. So it looks like both initiations occurred just above the aircraft impact damage. Now, you have to ask yourself why that is. There's some speculation there. that if there was charges, that's where the charges wouldn't have been disturbed. They could have been armored for fire, and but they wouldn't have been disturbed and moved out of place relative to the columns. So that's what I believe happened.
Right, and obviously if you're going to bring down these buildings with all these people inside and do this crazy act, you're going to need some meticulous planning, and so that would involve also, where the airplane hits, and all of that as well. So no, I mean, that's something that people do need to look into. And something else too, because I noticed you had a paper back in 2007 you wrote with Dr. Frank Legg, if I'm pronouncing his name right.
That's right.
Arguing that the Twin Towers' sudden collapse initiations were impossible. So, I mean, boiling it down for our laymen out there, why would that be impossible?
Well, because it would have been heat, and if it was heat-induced, we mean a natural sudden collapse couldn't have happened. What happens when most people might be familiar with what we call a stress-strain curve, and when you go past the yield point into the plastic region, you need more stress. You need more force to continue to deform it, at least for a while. Well, that's called strain hardening. So when you yield something, to have additional yielding, you need to put more load on it. In other words, it gets stronger for a time. If you pull the wire apart, the load is a certain amount, and then you need a little more load to get to the fracture point. So what we're saying is, when the columns yield it, and this is valid even with heat softening. It's just a relative thing. When you get an initial yield, to get more yielding, you need more load or more heat to soften it more. So it can't happen right away in a heat weakening situation. And that paper's still valid.
And it's interesting too. I want this to make it on the show here, because we were talking the other day on the phone, and we were on the phone for a few hours there. But you mentioned something to me. I thought it was very profound to think about the way that the buildings came down, and about how your family car can't go as fast or accelerate to do that. Can you explain that to our audience?
Yeah, sure. At any rate, I mean, as a kid, I was a drag strip fan. So it was just curious to me. The buildings excited. The North Tower, David Chandler has pretty good measurements on, and like I said, it's about 64% of the rate of gravity, the acceleration. If you were to do that on the drag strip, it would be an 11.2 second quarter mile. That is quite fast. Anybody that knows anything about drag racing knows that is not a stock car. Okay, that has to be a car that's souped up somehow. Most family cars today, if they could do a 16-second quarter mile, they're lucky. So this thing accelerates faster. It collapses faster than you can drive your car with the pedal completely depressed. Completely. Even I have a Z28 Camaro. That car won't go that fast. I could probably do a 13-second quarter mile in that car with 325 horsepower. So it just shows you, it hits home, I think, when you realize they collapsed that fast.
Well, I love examples like that because you can visualize that, and that's something that most people can identify with, and that's a point that needs to be made over and over again.
Yeah. It was something like, it was 7 to 10 stories per second. It was really fast. So it's pretty difficult to have that happen. The only way that can happen is, most of the structure was softened and removed.
Now, you touched on this a little. I want to just kind of go back to it. Obviously, we're in an information war here, and there's another side and bringing up these very common arguments. What's the most common arguments you hear against your analysis, or just the controlled demolition evidence in general, and how do you respond to it?
Well, they try to say the tilt affected it, that the columns just missed, but they can't explain that. The tilt doesn't cause the columns to misalign. If you do the math, a 1-degree tilt misaligns the columns on the complete other side of the building by 3/8 of an inch. It's nothing more than the cosine, the cosine of the angle, okay, subtracted from the adjacent side from the hypotenuse. It's not enough. It's insignificant. So that's one thing. They don't have a way to generate a shift and cause those columns to miss. That's the biggest argument. And they try to use the tilt to do that. They tried to use the tilt to say that the jolt would be smeared out. It would have been a bunch of mini jolts. But that's not. The kinetic energy argument completely makes that moot because there's not enough kinetic energy. It doesn't even matter if you have an initial jolt or not. The initial load is not the criteria. It's the overall energy. If you don't have enough energy to completely collapse those columns, the collapse is not going to propagate vertically. And that's what we found in the new paper. Well, that's what we explained. We knew that for quite some time, but we've explained it publicly now, and it's in a published paper.
Right. Now, switching gears here, because the show, we focus on the evidence, but we also talk about activism, about doing something about the evidence. And something that you've seen people doing, well, for years, they've been approaching public figures, either in person or on programs like C-SPAN, with certain questions. And unfortunately, the people in Congress, people in positions of prominence, even people who are prosecutors, aren't necessarily required to read a physics book before they take their oath of office. And sometimes these questions will go over their heads, and you get kind of this arrogant answer because they really don't know. So if somebody were to approach a person in a position of influence, like a politician or a prosecutor, whoever, who may not have a technical background, how would you boil all of this down to a single statement or a question?
Well, I would ask them, it doesn't, I'm not trying to be self-aggrandizing here. I'd ask them why the building doesn't decelerate. Just like I would ask them, as far as the North Tower is concerned, and I would ask them why Building 7 is in complete free fall for 8 stories. Symmetric free fall. And, you've done that. All they could do is tell you to go back to you. So you can bother these people, but they're going to put you off. And I'm not saying to stop it. I think people like Rudy Giuliani, pressure needs to be applied somehow to have people like Rudy Giuliani testify. Okay? Because Rudy, I think, was involved in several aspects of this. One, getting rid of the evidence, the steel, getting rid of the steel before it could be fully examined, and he was involved in keeping the site somewhat locked down. And he also was the one who provided the cover story for setting charges in Building 7, and that was through his the project to build out his Office of Emergency Management on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7. That's when those charges had to be placed. And I think I was telling you the company that did that job, the name of the company is AMEC, A-M-E-C. It's a British equivalent to Halliburton. And they also did the work on the wing of the Pentagon that was hit prior to 9/11, and they were also hired to help clean up Ground Zero by Rudy Giuliani. So there's a lot of connections there, and Rudy's actions as far as the steel and his insistence on putting that office in Building 7 that was objected to by quite a number of New York City security officials is very strange, and he needs to answer for that. Are those things?
And it's so strange that you would put that there after the trade towers had been attacked allegedly by terrorists in 1993. That you would put them so close to to a potential target, for a future event. And it's funny because we talk about this, and I've taken this approach now where I play devil's advocate, and I say, okay, let's say that it's Al-Qaeda. That really did us harm that day. Now, you take a look at the impossibility of the building collapses. What if you approach it from another angle that says, well, maybe their plan was so good, so in-depth, that there was more to the story than just the planes hitting, as the science proves, okay? Right. So why would you not investigate whether or not foreign agents infiltrated these companies and had access to these buildings?
Well, of course. We don't have to presume guilt on anybody's part. We have to investigate it right. It's obvious that the buildings were imploded. So what would an investigation do then? Okay, you might blame the planes to some degree, but you're going to say, all right, there had to be charges in those buildings. You should be interrogating anybody that had access to those buildings. That wasn't done. And that's not saying who did it. That's saying somebody had access to those buildings, and we want to find out who. Somebody who had access set charges in those buildings. And that hasn't been done to this day. Nobody's been interrogated along those lines. It's amazing. I mean, the evidence for charges it's huge. It's enormous. I mean, come on, it's silly. People on the internet say there's no sounds. There's firemen saying they saw, heard, and felt explosions. They say they saw flashes going around the building like a belt. I mean, there's reason to be interrogating people who had access to those interiors. And I don't mean average office workers. I mean maintenance people, contractors, security people, people like that. And that investigation has not been done yet.
And that's what a real investigation would look like. Again, folks, this is a way to give the other side, to help them save face, to make them look at the evidence in a way that is objective. They can still blame it on the foreign boogeyman that they want to blame it on, but to see if this operation was more elaborate than we were originally told, and why would you not want to find out that so that you can prevent that from ever happening again, so that we make safeguards to keep people from being able to get access to these kinds of buildings and doing this kind of thing. And that is an approach where I think both sides of this debate can meet halfway. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right, and I think it has to be done. One more thing we should mention here is how we believe access to the interior of the Twin Towers occurred. We already talked about Building 7 and the Office of Emergency Management cover. And that would have been through the elevator modernization program that was going on for 8 months prior to 9/11. 8 full months. When people say it would have taken time, well, they had 8 full months. And the outfit that was doing that work was a little-known elevator company named Ace Elevator, who somehow won the contract away from Otis Elevator, who designed the system and had the maintenance contract since the buildings were open through the mid-'90s when Ace won it from them somehow. And I sent you something about the interesting part. Recently, in 2011, the Empire State Building said it was going to do an elevator modernization. And there's 67 elevators in the Empire State Building. Each Twin Tower had 99. In that article I sent you, it was an Associated Press article from June 2011, the Empire State Building officials said they only considered 3 companies worthy to compete. One was Otis, the other one was Schindler, and the third was Tyson Krupp. So this is not something that any willy-nilly company can do. And Ace Elevator, I think the towers were 90% of their business. Now they did have, in fairness, they did hire some of the former mechanics from Otis, but they were completely new management. And the Empire State Building people said the program management was a big reason for them selecting Otis. So you can't just say you have workers from the other crew. You need the management team. Upgrading those elevator systems is a big job. But like I said, it was done in the 8 months before 9/11. That program was going on. And this is verified through Elevator World Magazine. They show it right on the front cover in the March 2001 issue that it was the biggest elevator modernization ever undertaken, the Twin Towers, in 2001. And they had access to the core columns unobserved doing an elevator modernization. You could get to every one of those core columns completely unobserved. So that's the most likely time the charges would have been set in those buildings. So there is means and opportunity, okay?
Right, and that's what this is about, folks. And again, we're separate from AE 9/11 Truth, so we kind of expand sometimes, but we're not making accusations, but this is what a real investigation sounds like right here, because again, you do those logic puzzles or whatever they're called, logic proofs in math class in high school, and that's supposed to teach you how to think with certain givens, and then you deduce certain results. So given that the collapse or the destruction of the Twin Towers in Building 7, right now we're just talking about Twin Towers, though. The Twin Towers is impossible unless you have explosives involved, as we've laid out the science for that. Given this situation, then you look at, okay, well, there were explosives to help bring the buildings down. When were they put in? What kind of opportunities were there? And that's what, like, real detective work, real police work is about. And so you start looking at suspects and who had the opportunities to do that. And that's where an investigation would have to come from, regardless of who you think was behind it. And these were the types of people that would have to be questioned if the 9/11 Commission really was doing the work that they claimed to be doing.
Right. Well, Richard Gage, just so you know, Richard believes, he says publicly that the elevator crews need to be interrogated.
Right.
So he doesn't feign from that. We're not saying exactly what person would have been involved. We're saying they need to be interrogated because that was an opportunity to plant demolition devices in those buildings.
Right. Now, I want to ask you, because I want to get your take on this. Because you've been involved with this for about the same amount of time as me. It's like 2006 was an awakening year for a lot of people in this movement. Right. You've been able to watch this. You've participated in Remember Building 7 and NYC Can. You know, what are we doing right as a movement, and what are we doing wrong as a movement?
Well, I can only give my personal opinion on that. I think you want to get more high-powered legal people involved is where I would go. In New Jersey, there's a guy here, Dave Mcilvaine, I think is how you pronounce his name. He's a lawyer, and he's trying to get a group of us, myself. He mentioned that he has a professor from NJIT and others. He wants us to go to Trenton and to meet with legislators there. So I think getting those kind of people, they have the legal prowess and the oomph, if you will, to possibly get something moving.
Right, and I've stressed that too on this show, is that obviously you want to educate the general public. You want more people on your side, and you want them sympathetic to your cause. And actually, we're going to have a show very soon, folks, on nonviolent resistance. I think it's long overdue that we just focus an entire episode on that. And I was talking to Dave Schlesinger the other night, and he basically explained to me it's a question of getting people, getting the public that's not interested in a topic to sympathize more with you than with the oppressors or whatever. We'll go over that in more detail later episode. But basically, yeah, that's important in itself, but you also want to target those people who can do more than just talk to their friends about it, who can actually use their influence to get a real investigation initiated. And so you're right, I agree with you completely, but it's a problem of just getting past this wall, breaking through not just the establishment wall put up, but also the cognitive dissonance, because after all, these people are still human too, and they have their own biases. And a lot of people, I was talking to someone the other day about this, and the person just said, you might be right, but I just don't want to believe that, because it doesn't fit into my worldview. And so, it's all of these obstacles in our way, and that's what we're still chipping away at.
Well, like I said, I would follow a legal approach. I mean, every time you hear that the American Civil Liberties Union or somebody like that they bring lawsuits. Okay, it's a little more powerful than just a number of people at a demonstration. I mean, that's what you need. You need lawsuits brought for discovery. You need these kind of people to approach people they know that are in power. Everybody's not involved in this conspiracy. Okay, so that's the path I think would bear more fruit. I'm not saying not to keep educating the public, absolutely, and you need the public support. And I think the public support is there. Personally, I mean, I talked to Pam. What's Pam, the one girl that Pam
Sensi?
Pam Sensi, right. I talked to her a few weeks ago, and I asked her about her trip, and she said, her trip across the United States, her and the other girl did that several months ago, and she said people were very open to it. So I think the public support is there. Now it's a matter of getting more high-powered framework in place, and that's legal framework. So there's several lawyers that have been involved in the cause. I think that needs to be expanded, and they need to see how to move it.
Right, and then that other girl that you mentioned, it was Rena Patty, another great activist with AE 9/11 Truth. Now, I want to get your take on this. What are you afraid happens if we don't get a real investigation, if this issue is allowed to just fade into the dustbin of history and people forget about all this evidence that you're presenting, Richard Gage is presenting? What happens to America? What happens to the world in your view?
Well, it'll be a degenerate situation, okay? Somebody got away with a major crime. No different than the Kennedy assassination. Very few people believe Lee Harvey Oswald did that himself. It was never, the investigation never indicted anybody else, and it was just left to fester, and the public lost faith in government through that. All three major assassinations in the 60s caused that, and that's the same kind of thing that will happen here. You'll have a certain amount of apathy, and the country's going to be doing the wrong things. And I want to say, I am not proposing revolution. I'm proposing cleaning up the filth and the very wrong act that was committed on that day, and cleansing our country of that. And that can be done through our legal framework if it's made to work.
Right, and that's funny because I was just talking to somebody who is skeptical, of this. It hasn't really refuted anything, just doesn't want to believe it, like I said. And this person said to me, what do you want, a civil war? And obviously I don't. And it shows that people's minds immediately jump to that scenario. And what I've proposed from the very beginning, every week on this show, is the justice system, to let the justice system work. And the next question I always get from folks is, well, aren't you afraid of what it would do to America? And you mentioned if we don't do something, people will lose faith in the government. But a lot of people believe, too, that if we do expose this and make it widely known, that people will lose faith in the government. And my opinion on that, and you can comment on this too, is that people should lose faith in the government because the government hasn't really done anything to keep the faith of the public, to rightfully keep the faith of the public, but people would have more faith in the American people, in themselves. And I've argued this many times that exposing this and making this widely known and righting this wrong would not harm America. Right. In the long run, it would make America a stronger place, and I guarantee you, not just within America, but all over the world, any government, any persons that would try to cover up something like this in the future, they would back away from it because they'd be scared of doing it. 10 years or 12 years, I guess, here we are now, is not a lot of time in the big scheme of history and existence. And so the American people rising up and doing something and speaking out and educating the public and writing this would be one of the best things that could not just happen for America and not just solidify our place as really awesome people in history, but would benefit the world and would be a black eye against tyranny.
Right, absolutely, yeah. I'll give a small microcosm type thing. I think it was a township or it was a small municipality in California. This was several years ago, 4 to 5 years ago. And there was two, basically they were crooks. Somehow got in power, and they were paying themselves $800,000 apiece a year. Imagine that. I'm talking like a township-size municipality. Well, finally something did happen, all right? They were removed, okay? When the right people got a hold of that, it got corrected. So, you can have crooks in power and continuing to, just denigrate or, have a degenerate system, or you can, make the choice to correct it. And right now, up to this point, with this, it's such a major crime. I think that there's a lot of influence behind the perpetrators of this crime. There's no doubt in my mind, whoever they were. There's influence because it has not been investigated properly thus far, and the story we've gotten is basically a cock and bull story. It's nonsense. Okay, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and we've proven that in many ways. So. It's just a matter of public will, I mean, you're fighting a major machine. Unfortunately, there's a level of power there that didn't want to come clean on this, and that can only be because they were involved. And there's influence there, and it is an information war. But I still think that the legal approach with enough lawyers can make a dent that hasn't been made yet. The public support is there for that.
You're right, and it is an information war, and you are right at the front lines of it. Folks, we are out of time, but we've been talking to Tony Szamboti, his new paper, Some Misunderstandings Related to the World Trade Center Collapse Analysis, which he wrote with other gentlemen there, is going to be available at 911freefall.com. Tony, I want to thank you for coming on the program. Remember, folks, you can listen to this show every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.
Years after 9/11, experts are speaking out about what really destroyed the Twin Towers and Building 7.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
Go to 911expertspeakout.org.